Hi everyone, let's get started. I know some classes are getting out of 4, so some people may join us, but I missed my introductory remarks. That's not a problem. I'm Paige Fortna. I'm the director of the Saltzman Institute, and I'm really glad to be kicking us off today for this panel on accountability and influence over the Taliban and human rights. And I want to thank our panelists for sharing their time and their expertise with us on this important topic. This event is part of a relatively new series at the Saltzman Institute titled Beyond the Headlines, Overlooked Conflicts and the Prospects for Peace. It's made possible with generous support from ISERP, the Institute for Social and Economic Research and Policy here at Columbia. And we started this kind of in response to the fact that there are a couple of conflicts at the moment in the world that are getting lots and lots of media attention in the West, but there are, of course, other conflicts and crises and issues that are continuing or starting to get much less attention here in the West. So our hope is that this series will help us kind of keep a focus on some of the conflicts that are less well attended to in the news media. And of course, one of the crises that was very, very much in the news in the West for a long time was Afghanistan, but then of course it's fallen out of the news, at least here in the US, a fair amount since the withdrawal of the US from that country in 2021. So I think it's particularly important that we keep a focus on that country and that conflict. And so I'm just going to introduce our moderator today, and then he'll introduce the panelists. And I want to apologize in advance that I teach after this panel, so I'm going to slip out a little bit early to finish preparing for class. But it's really my pleasure to introduce to you. Some of you already know him, our moderator today, my colleague Sibghatullah Ghaznawi. He is an associate research scholar at the Saltzman Institute. Prior to coming to Columbia, he was the deputy minister for municipalities and the independent director of local governance of Afghanistan, and over a long career held many senior positions within the Afghan government, and has also conducted really extensive field research in Afghanistan on topics relating to international development, democratization, and human rights. His current research focuses on political stability in post-conflict settings, including in Afghanistan. Since arriving at the Saltzman Institute, he's been with us since the fall of 2022. He's been working on the important issue of pragmatic engagement with the Taliban over critical issues like women's and girls' rights and inclusive governance, topic of our discussion today. So he brings to this conversation a really deep understanding of the political dynamics in Afghanistan, as well as invaluable expertise on the successes and failures of development programs and local stability. So we've been very fortunate to have Sibgat as part of our intellectual community at Saltzman and at Columbia for several years now, and thank him for organizing this terrific panel to enlighten us all on this important topic. And with that, I will turn the floor over to Sibgat, who will introduce our panel. So thanks everyone for coming today. And sorry it's so cold in here.
Thank you very much, Paige, for making this possible and supporting me on this, and also on the sessions that we had previously at the Institute. As you well said, that yes, so many other conflicts have taken Afghanistan off the headlines, while the reality is that a lot is going in Afghanistan, which is almost a crisis, at least for half of the population. So I would like to join me in welcoming our distinguished guests today, Dr. Halima Kazem and Mr. Shahmahmood Miakhel. Welcome and thank you very much for joining us on a very short notice. I understand that, but you're kind to join us. Dr. Halima Kazem is the associate director of Stanford University's program in Feminist Gender Sexuality Studies. Halima's work is deeply rooted in feminist methodologies and 26 years of working as a journalist, lecturer, human rights researcher, oral historian, and filmmaker. Her research intersects in the areas of gender, empire, human rights, media, with a focus on Afghanistan. The good news is that her book is coming. It's a feminist history of Afghanistan, resisting the erasure of women. This book It narrates the little told feminist history of women movements in Afghanistan. Thank you very much for paying attention to this important topic. Halima is also collaborating with Hoover Institute at Stanford University as an oral historian in building an oral history archive about US war in Afghanistan. And I think you have already conducted about 500 or a few hundred interviews on it.
Almost 450 hours.
Yes.
Yeah.
50 hours. So that's the great work. In her early career, she was an investigative journalist, and she has published 300 news features with and dozens of video stories with different platforms, including Los Angeles Times, Christian Science Monitor, The Guardian, Newsweek, and many others. Before joining Stanford University, Dr. Kazem also taught at San Jose State University for more than a decade. I would also like to introduce, welcome, Dr. This panel. I would also like to welcome Mr. Shahmahmood Miakhel. First, I will say a few words. My first introduction to him was in 2004 when he was Deputy Minister of the Ministry of Interior in Afghanistan. And he had initiated a very important program called Afghanistan Stabilization Program. And I joined that program as a provincial advisor at that time. Shahmahmood Miakhel is a senior expert in governance, defense, and peace building. He currently serves as a founding member and head of external relations for the pro-democratic movement of Afghanistan. Previously, he served as first deputy and acting minister of defense for Afghanistan, governor of Nangarhar province, which is the second largest province of Afghanistan by population. And also he was director of the Institute of United States Institute of Peace in Afghanistan. And also he served as senior advisor on Afghanistan to the United States Institute of Peace here in Washington, D.C. Both of our guests have deep understanding of Afghanistan and the region and were involved with Afghanistan and the region on different levels. And that's why we have asked them to give us time today to discuss that the human rights situation in Afghanistan. Why is it falling from the headlines? And why are agencies like United Nations and government of United States not giving it the attention that the human rights issues deserve? Just to share a few figures with you. Where in last 3 years, the government in Afghanistan, or the de facto authorities, or whatever we call them, they have issued more than 50 decrees that have explicitly or in some manner restricting women from their basic rights, like attending educational institutions, going outside the home, or working. Population of Afghanistan is almost 40 million, so it means 20 million people are subjected to this restrictive policies. Second thing is that when we look to the recent history of last 3 years of the engagement of the United Nations, United States and European countries and other regional countries around Afghanistan, we see that human rights was never on the top of their agenda when they were talking to the government, to the de facto authorities in Afghanistan. I will just share a very brief history. When we look to the first Doha engagement between the regional stakeholders on Afghanistan, human rights concerns were on the top, then counter-narcotics and drug trafficking, inclusive governance, and counter-terrorism. In the second meeting, human rights and governance were second, counter-narcotics and counter-terrorism was the first issue to be discussed. In the third meeting, what happened, the Taliban participated and they brought the economic development and their formal recognition by the international community to the top of the agenda. in the human rights went to the bottom. And in similar way, when we look to engagement of China and other regional countries, Uzbekistan, Pakistan, Iran, in India with Taliban, we never see human rights issues on the top. So today, I would like to ask our panelists on this topic that how does the engagement of the United Nations today and in the past 3 years, and I would like to ask this question from Dr. Halima Kazem, that how the UN engagement aligns with the objectives, with the UN objectives, and how it has evolved, this engagement evolved over the past 3 years. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for hosting us here, and thank you for inviting me. And I'm honored to share the panel with Mr. Miakhel, who I've known for a very long time, worked closely on projects inside Afghanistan. And he is actually, his voice is in our oral history collection at over 150 interviews, 450 hours. And it will launch, or our archive will launch August, September of this year. So a lot of these questions get answered in the complex interviews that I've been doing for the last 3 years with former diplomats, Afghan government officials, Afghan and US military generals. So a lot of these layers get uncovered. To answer your question, I'd like to just divide the time period since the collapse of the Republic into possibly 2 at this point. We might be hitting a 3rd period. I think about things in periodization, and I try to periodize. So original UN objectives 2021, I was going back to the UNAMA mandate of 2021 and just kind of thinking about what they were saying at the time. And the UN approach initially rested on the assumption, and this is my reading of what their mandate was, of moderate engagement. So all of these things are so politically charged: engagement, pragmatic engagement, moderate engagement. There are no clear definitions to what this is directly in each conflict context. So the assumption that moderate engagement could lead to the Taliban evolving towards a minimally acceptable governance model, which included, so this was the original thinking, that this could be where Afghanistan could go with this de facto regime. That 1, protection of basic human rights, especially women's and girls' rights. 2, counterterrorism cooperation, especially against ISIS-K. 3, counter-narcotics efforts to limit the heroin trade. And 4, encouraging inclusive governance to avoid Afghanistan becoming a pariah state. These were laid out in UNAMA's 2021 mandate. And the original logic of engagement over isolation rested on the experiences of the 1996, the first round of the Taliban regime, and it had catastrophic results. A lot of us in the room either lived through it or monitored it from the diaspora. Human rights abuses worsened, international terrorism thrived, and humanitarian crisis escalated. So in this post-Republic collapse, engagement was the lesser evil. So the idea was access by influence over the Taliban. Many of us told, expressed to the UN and to a lot of stakeholders that this was not going to work with a regime that was rooted in ideology, that they weren't going to make things transactional. And okay, so now period 1, period 2, the evolution of this 2022 to 2025, Taliban rejection of demands on women's rights, closure of girls almost immediately, girls' schools, September 2021, and banning women from workplaces, and now really just erasing them from public places, from having a public presence. So almost more than 80 edicts concerning women. And then, so a couple of things, focus. So the UN then started to take this approach. Focus shifted toward humanitarian access and economic stability, deprioritizing political reforms. So the original objectives shifted. And the UN supported private sector development, believing economic engagement could indirectly empower moderates within the Taliban ranks. And this was a November 2023 UN independent assessment. So the UN's idealistic approach had to became, and I'm not advocating for engagement, non-engagement, what kind of engagement, but from the reading of the UN's activities and documents, the UN's idealistic approach had become pragmatic and transactional with the Taliban. They realized that engagement alone is insufficient without, after all of this, we realize today that engagement alone is insufficient without serious conditionality. So I will talk later about a strategy, but a hybrid strategy of engagement and credible pressure is needed. So those are my.
Thank you very much. I would like to ask Miakhel the same question with an addition that how does UN assess its effectiveness of its engagement or the negotiation it has so far?
Okay, good afternoon, and also thank you very much, Dr. Craig and Center and Dr. Seppa for inviting me, and also it is my pleasure to be with Dr. Kazem. We've known each other for a long time, and also see some old new friends, young people in this room. That is also encouraging. You just said is less focus, but there are some interests, existing in Afghanistan, and I see these people there. I will go a little bit further, maybe because of age. I was involved with Afghanistan issues for the last 50 years, so one way or another. I work as a reporter, work for NGOs, work for the UN several years, and also, work with the USIP Research Institute for 10 years, and work in the government positions. If you just confess honestly, engagement or disengagement and isolation and all these policies has not worked. And when we just say we, meaning the Afghans, regional countries, international community, we all failed. We didn't come with the right approach. This is not new things with the Taliban. Because, and she is here because we had this discussion, many years back here in Kabul. In 2002 and 2003, the same argument was existing, here. Should we focus on the rules of law, good governance, or to bring bad guys inside the tent, or to stay outside of the tent? Those who were known human rights violators, in the country. Those who believe that those who are, involved in the human rights violations before, because there was a civil war in Afghanistan. We just go back in the root cause of the problems. So they just said, bring them inside the tent, then they will not create a problem. But there was a group of us, we were saying, no, if you bring them inside the tent, you will give the government power, and then will violate the human rights there. So those who were in this belief, they were isolated, some left the government one way or another. So that was the big issue. So if you want to ask, Taliban, they are happy with the status quo. They don't care if they are recognized or not recognized. When we just talk about Taliban, or somebody, not talking about different views in the system, in every government and every administration, people have different views, but the people in the top make their decisions. Those Taliban who are, making decisions, they don't care about the international recognition. They don't care about the human rights. They are happy with the status quo. They can collect money, tax people, even from the laborers, on the street, they tax them also. And they have enough money, but they don't care about the rest of the people, if it is women or men and others. So that was the reason is the international community, the UN and others, they didn't come with a good approach. So the approach is just to, engage them and just have a conference here and there. But in the reality, those conferences which happened in Qatar, they failed. Those 3 conferences happened by the UN, and Qatar didn't work there. So that was, as long as we don't have a strategy how to have a legitimate government in Afghanistan, we will, the Taliban will be involved in the human rights violation. They will not open the school. Just imagine, a young boy is 10 years old now, and 10 years from now, what will happen? It will be 20. So closing the schools and opening the madrasas. So eventually what will happen in the country? So that was the reason is the UN approach or the regional approach or bilateral approach didn't work. Each country, each organization, they just engaged with the Taliban for their narrow, short interests. That was it didn't work. And so if there's not like holistic approach, understanding, I don't believe in isolation, these things cannot be solved. But this is summarized it.
I'm
Thank you.
just gonna have one more point on my notes, that the problem was, and I don't think that people, that the UN predicted this, is that the Taliban learned to manipulate engagement very quickly without conceding major demands. They accept aid and investments from regional countries and aid from the West, but reject political or rights-based conditions without any repercussions. And engagement ensures humanitarian access, but in the current state. So right now, the reality is engagement ensures humanitarian access for Afghans and the Taliban, but does not leverage political behavior.
So, taking from these points that Miakhel also pointed to the legitimate government, the other important aspects of the engagement or disengagement not working. So what do you think we have learned?
My personal view, we have not learned that much, or if we learned, we have not applied. So the reason is that because transition justice was a big issue in 20 years of republic. So it was not addressed that issue. There was a lot of discussion. Even the parliament just gave themselves a blanket immunity. Those who are, violators of human rights, they should not be prosecuted. So the reason was that, the problem is if you just go, I'm not saying you just put myself in the Taliban shoes, If you just ask them human rights, they say, yes, you have so many other human rights violators the other side of the table. They're worse than us. Why you are not talking about that and just talking about us? These are the realities. So that was the reason I just say with the legitimate government, that is the key. If you don't have a solution for that, then we will not have a solution for human rights issues. We will not have a solution to address the poverty, not, education issues and all these things. But the question is how to do that. That is also not easy issue because there is no consensus. Even among the Taliban, there is no consensus on all these issues. You saw so many of their top leaders, they are against the current, policy of the Kandahar group. Like closing schools and others or engagement with the international community. So our regions, just because our problem is, Afghan problem, regional problem, international problem, they all they have a role in the stability and also the instability of Afghanistan. So our region also not one region. Iran has a one interest, Pakistan has another interest, Central Asian countries have a different interest, China, Russia, India, US and Turkey and Arab, others. So that was, we didn't have, able to put together all these issues. The solution is, the only solution I see these days, forget the past, what has happened. That is the UN resolution, which has happened last year, I believe, based on the report of Sinaroglu. That is, if we have a roadmap for implementation of that, I think that would be the only solution I just see it. I don't see any other because the UN cannot do things by itself. So UN is a part of the big organization and there is a P5 has a role. So if the P5 doesn't, countries give a, authority or mandate, to the UN cannot do that much. So on that resolution, yes, some people agree or not agree, but it was passed by the UN Security Council. So if we have implementation for that, all these issues will be addressed there. Which is meaning is we will not exclude anyone. Even Taliban should not be excluded because among the Afghans, or some people are, there are different kind of views. Some say, no, let's eliminate Taliban and then, destroy them and then we will just take power, Some people think like that way, but some people say, no, that is not the solution also, and fighting is not the solution. So we should have an inclusive process and not talk about individuals, because when you talk about individuals, then it's difficult to have a clean hand,
We'll come to this regional issue and also the issue of governance, but before going to that question, I would like to ask you, Dr. Kazem, about the engagements of the US government under the leadership of Mr. Thomas West that happened. How do you see that? And how did he and his team evaluate it and assess their success?
Okay, so I can address that, but I think addressing the previous question in the same process is going to be important, is what we have learned. So in the oral histories, I sit with people who were at these very specific moments at Bonn, at the emergency lojaga, at the constitutional lojaga. So there are like different signposts through the interview that I stop people, especially people who are involved in those processes. And so just to synthesize, just a little bit here for you, what we learned is what we learned, and I learned from the talking by the interviews from the American generals like General Petraeus, General Eikenberry, McChrystal. I've interviewed all of them. Is that the U.S. I'm going to just take a lot more long-term approach, because what Tom West is able or unable to do is tied to a lot of what was wrong from the beginning. Is the generals say the U.S. reacted too quickly and didn't take enough time to plan for a retaliatory attack against Al Qaeda, and went in without a strategy. These coming from people who were in the Pentagon and in the government at the time, into the Bush administration. So that process was flawed, rushed, reactive. The Bonn process was very flawed. There's way more evidence coming out now that the Taliban wanted to engage in the Bonn process, that there was a moment for peace. I'm not advocating for the Taliban, I'm not advocating for any group, but the evidence is out there now, even with Ambassador Khalilzad saying, oh, there was a letter, all these, and I collect these kinds of different evidence. I just did an interview on Sunday with someone who's very critical to the process and was at Bonn and worked with the UN Special Envoy Lakhdar Brahimi on the Bonn process. The Bonn process was flawed. And then throughout the Karzai administration, the Taliban in those early years before the surge in 2007 wanted to engage and had a meaningful, but the US politically didn't want to show that they were going to engage. So there's a flawed process. And then the flaw was also that the Taliban would be much, their ideology wasn't deeply rooted, that they would be eventually come around to a liberal framework, to a market-based economy, to engaging, but their ideology is very different. It's not based on a Western liberal, market-oriented framework. And we didn't think that the US didn't think, and international players, that they would fall in line with that. So they were in for the long run, the long game, and we didn't learn that lesson from the first round. And there was no incentive, even at Doha, for the Taliban to stay on the terms of the Doha Agreement. I interview people who were in the presidential palace at the time, and people who were in these negotiations. And it's a failure of diplomacy. It's a failure of international relations. The US government engaged a militia group without engaging an elected government. Problems across the board in this government. But the first steps, and I document the first time, US government officials are engaging the Taliban at different times of the timeline, but there's a failure in democracy. These are all lessons learned that shouldn't be repeated, but for some reason, in the context of Afghanistan's conflict in the West, it gets repeated. They left out the republic. And I think, the withdrawal starts to have issues. And so to lean on and do be critical of Tom West and Rina Amiri, who were, making certain kinds of efforts in a limited Biden-Harris administration, which actually implemented the withdrawal, I might be a little bit misplaced here in the historical timeline.
Thank you very much, actually, for providing the background, and it helps to understand that efforts of today would be linked to so many events that happened in the recent history, and that would limit effectiveness of an effort. And I will take it that you conclude that about the efforts of the team of Congress. I think I would move to the regional engagement in strategy of the regional countries. And I will ask this question, Miakhel said from you. How do the regional countries, neighbors of Afghanistan, they frame their engagement with Taliban? And one thing I would like to point to, out of these neighbors, China has taken much bigger steps. They're just short of the formal recognition. But at the same time, they are also a permanent member. China is permanent member of Security Council. So how do they manage to not see all the human rights violations and issues and still engage in a different way?
No, and I just said the region, if you go back to the US policy, in the last 20 years, the US, they didn't have one strategy, every year there was a different strategy, so different objectives. And that was take 20 years, and we didn't achieve that much. That was a one issue was existing. With the Thomas office, the previous administration, they didn't want to talk about Afghanistan. They only have a limited engagement, human rights, humanitarian assistance, counter terrorism, and also engagement with the regional countries. But that was only 4 things they were just talking about there. So coming to specific the region, the problem is each region, each country has a different objectives. So for example, Pakistan would like to, have a weak government in Afghanistan, to have a control there, and they use state actors as a strategic tools, for their own objectives. So Iran has the same views also. The Central Asian countries, they just only, afraid from the expansion, or spreading of a terrorism there. Narcotics and others, they are just only concerned about that. Those countries should not be destabilized, in one way or another, because the governments, so there is also not a stable government, so dictatorships, in all these countries. So China also has a limited objective because they only care about the ETIM. How the ETIM should not, be strengthened or, should not create problem for there or ISK and others. But they are not the countries to invest. Political investment, military-wise or economic investment in others. So they are not, paying the bills. They're looking to the West, to the US and European and others. They should pay the bills and then they will engage by themselves. It doesn't work like that. So that was not only, new issues because they are not traditional donors on economic aids and, others. And Taliban is also happy with this kind of engagement. The reason was that they just have a bilateral engagement with each country. They will benefit. They don't want to have a regional or international approach because then there is a diverse views and then we have to align those views. And so that was, I believe, unless the region doesn't change their own, strategic approach, the issue of Afghanistan, if just say, okay, a stable Afghanistan is in their interest or not. If a stable Afghanistan is in their interest, then have to work for their stability. But if you know weak and unstable Afghanistan is in their interest, yes, they engage in that way. So far, I don't see a strategic shift, in the policies of both Iran and Pakistan or Central Asia or China that much. Because we see, China, there is an invested, they just want to just like the different contexts, mines context, but they have not invested here. Long time ago, I was a discussion with the Chinese, special envoy. Yeah, we are not in a hurry, we will just take our time. And if you just look back to the last 20 years, assistance, the China only gave walkie-talkies to Afghan government, not that much investment. Instead of that, they benefited, from the engagement of Afghanistan because of the trade and commerce and others. The same was Iran and Pakistan also. So they don't want to pay the bills. So
Just for the explanation purposes, ETM, Miakhel had mentioned that's East Turkestan movement. That's
Islamic movement of
Yes,
Afghanistan.
it's Ivoire minority struggling for their freedom and more rights. Yes.
Can I just add something to that? Is that the regional, so thinking about regional countries, and I think about it as an engagement logic. What is the engagement logic? And the thing is that the motivations for these regional countries are very different. And so trying to balance that. So I have in my notes here. So Pakistan obviously supports Taliban as a strategic depth policy concerned about TTP, or the Tehrik-i-Taliban Pakistan, cross-border terrorism. So they frame it as stability through Taliban cooperation. That's how they originally saw it, but that's not working out for them, to say the least, right now. And China's interested in natural resources and some terrorism control because we do share a border. Afghanistan shares border with China, and China has a pure economic security calculus when it comes to their logic. Iran's calculus is different, prioritizes border security, but also water sharing agreements. You've got climate change changing the area, and also refugee flows, because so that's a different calculus. And then you've got Uzbekistan focused on regional trade and access to Pakistani ports. So their motivation is not to upset the Taliban. There's a trans-Afghan railway project under works. So thinking about that calculus. And so India has low-level humanitarian engagement, and countering Pakistan-China influence. They're skeptical of the Taliban, but willing to engage. And then Turkey has some interest in that area as well, ideologically and security-wise. So thinking about those things and the calculus and what kind of logic of engagement the West is thinking about it, but what does the logic of engagement look like in reality in that region? And then the last thing I'll say is that you mentioned China on the UN Security Council. They have a responsibility for human rights obligations, but China emphasizes, and this was the danger of China on the Security Council, and I'm sorry if I'm going to offend somebody here, China emphasizes state sovereignty over human rights obligations, period. It contradicts broader UN Security Council expectations. We didn't know that? We did. And then furthermore, China frames Afghan issues like women's and girls' rights as internal Afghanistan issues. Cultural relativism, is that what we're engaging in now? That they're not international human rights? At what point was women's rights and girls' rights education not part of the UN Security Council's priorities? And so that becomes problematic. That's a more geopolitical issue here.
Thank you very much for.
Maybe on the China issues against that.
Sure.
China doesn't have an economic interest in Afghanistan. It's my personal view, because for economic interest, then you have to invest. If you invest, then you have an economic interest. And they don't want to invest, they're in Afghanistan. When I just said they have limited, because when the US was there, they just wanted, like the US should not use, Afghanistan against China. Or now they are more concerned about the ETIM, the Pakistan Islamic movement, they were just there. So that was, they just see the Taliban can prevent that, because Taliban sold their, argument to the region and also to the international community or to the Afghans. Taliban has changed. They are the one can prevent ISIS-K and other terrorist group, in the region. And that was, we can help you. But, as a governor of Nangarhar, and then I worked as the Minister of Defense, ISIS-K was defeated during my time in Nangarhar, And I know how they were supported, who supported them, there, and how the Taliban and they were just work together, the rank and files. So that was the reason you cannot, eliminate terrorism with terrorist groups, that's not possible.
And Nangarhar was probably the most secure when you were governor.
Yeah, but before I went there, it was insecure because of the escape.
Remember?
So that was the issue, when I just said the regional countries go back. So far they still believe on the old, story, good Taliban, bad Taliban, good tourists and bad tourists. If that mentality is not changed, then you cannot, solve these issues, there. And I believe, the more instability in Afghanistan, the more illegitimate government, eventually everyone will suffer. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Miakhel. Beside the international community that we spoke for last almost 40 minutes, also we are there, Afghans are there, Afghan population, politicians, civil society, and activists. I would like also to understand those dynamics. Currently, we have several political movements outside Afghanistan with links and in some cases with claims that they have influence inside Afghanistan as well. So these political groups, what are their dynamics? What are they doing? What they have learned from all what's going on the outside, all the mistakes that you rightly mentioned about the early diplomacy, failure of the early engagement, not having a good planning, diversity of the regional interests. So what have the Afghan political groups have learned from it, and how are they bringing that into their actions, into their politics? I would like to ask this question, Miakhel, first from you, and then I will ask Dr. Kazem.
The Afghan, opposition to Taliban, there are 3-4 categories. One category people, they just, believe on military struggle. And then the argument they say, there are a few arguments they are making. One is Taliban is bad. Taliban is supported by Pakistan. So the US handed over the government to Taliban. That is the one argument. But in the same time, then we asking the US and Taliban to remove Taliban and just bring us back, That doesn't work, that is the one category of, people. One category of people is political opposition. They are not believing on war, they are believing on inclusive process, including me. I'm believing on that process, inclusive process. You cannot exclude Taliban, you cannot exclude anyone, and we just give, voice to the people and people will make a decision, how to do that. We need some process, there. So in that process, we will not talk about individual. And if you just talk about individual, then again, then you have a problem, there. And the third group of Taliban opposition is the civil society. Unfortunately, civil society is also fragmented, divided on the political lines, there. And then the other opposition, people don't like the Taliban, but they're silent majority, they're not active, there. So in politics, silent majority is not counted, there. So that was the reason the Afghan and opposition Taliban, they are very fragmented, more fragmented than they were when the Republic was there.
Just to
and Taliban is happy with this situation.
No, how can these political movements and groups take advantage of the human rights issues and specifically rights of girls and women and come together, forgetting about many other things, but this one issue almost everybody agrees on?
The Taliban are, enemies of themselves. In the last 3-4 years, they created, policies, which is give argument to the other side to just talk about that. For example, if the Taliban just kept open the schools for girls, nobody was talking about the human rights. That. If they only accepted just the Afghan flag, and then put their own flags there, nobody will talk about the Taliban, that much. So the Taliban themselves creating, news, or narratives for the opposition to just use it against them, every day. So that was the reason these scattered activities of the Taliban, the political opposition or military people who are opposition, they, have a pressure on the Taliban, there. It worked so far because Taliban has not been recognized, internationally. Many people inside the Taliban, they say, okay, the current policy is not good. And like closing school or disengagement, with the international community, not have, legitimacy and others. Many Taliban leadership is not happy with that. On many of these current situation, the isolation, everyone is arguing, this is not good.
So the political movements and groups, which you are also leading one of that group right now, is there a consensus or is there an intention, or do you think that it should be taken to the table that these groups should come together on the human rights issues and recalibrate their approach to it?
No, on the topics is most of the opposition or the Afghans or the regional community, they agree on the topic. For example, the current situation is not acceptable. Isolation is not in the interest of anyone. There, human rights violation. The school should be open. The girls and women should give them a chance for education. There are no differences on the themes. But the problem is the personalities, there. Because 40 years or 50 years, background, difficult to forget the past, Even if you don't want to live in the past, but you cannot forget the past also. So that was the reason that, most of our, political, or those people who acted in the politics, they not, I'm not bragging by myself, but you are not coming with a good formula, because you have to agree on principles, If you don't agree on principles, just make a deal or just to get a project or to get a position back in the government, for self-interest, then it's very difficult, to move forward. I have attended all these conferences, I have been in many of these things. That was my disagreement, with them on this issue. You want to talk about yourself or your political group or ethnic group or language group or whatever, or you just want to bring stability out to Afghanistan. That is the two different things.
Thank you, Miakhel. Dr. Halima, I would ask the same question, but with a little addition to it. Seeing the fragmentation of so many different issues amongst the Afghan political groups, but as Miakhel mentioned, there is consensus on the human rights issue. But still, we do not see any organized pressure over the Taliban to change their behavior on the ground. Do you see an opportunity that this can happen? That the political groups can engage, can do innovations in their approach?
I think first to differentiate a bit when we say political groups or activism, political activism or lobbying in that way, there are internal groups that we shouldn't discount. They're covert. The resistance does take shape on the ground in Afghanistan. I'm in touch with a lot of groups, men's groups, women's groups, mixed. And then there are groups in exile, so diasporic groups. And if there are any grad students or anyone interested in good PhD dissertation topic, I would study the effectiveness of the Afghan diaspora movements in engaging politically, like in the 80s and in the 90s, with the the governments inside and the groups inside Afghanistan. Because I came to the United States in 1980. I was very young, I watched that generation, my father's generation, my mother and father, who were politically active, their generation engage as a diaspora group. They were former academics, engage in trying to develop coalitions and trying to engage. And we went to rallies called Free Afghanistan because the Soviet Union was still occupying Afghanistan. And I remember, going to all these rallies as a toddler, like as a young child. So the dynamics of diasporas are very interesting. And for the group that left Afghanistan after the fall of the republic, I see this repeated cycle of diaspora politics. And it's really interesting to study the dynamics and the formation of that, the process of the settlement and the assimilation to the life here. So I think that's really important to think about, and the ways that they form. It wasn't as effective as it could have been, I think, in the 80s and 90s, being an observer. So we have these groups in exile, and these groups in exile, their personal politics start to take different shapes, ethnic shapes, when they're in exile, that they do inside the country. So I think some more research and some more understanding about these groups and the historical aspect, the influence of diaspora groups would be really interesting. Here, yes, I mean, I just last month I did a women's rights lecture for the United Afghan Front, which is run by General Sameh Sadat, who was one of the last commanders in Afghanistan. They're interested in learning how their efforts could help elevate the issue of women's rights in Afghanistan. Then there's the NRF. So there are all these different groups that are trying to create, and then there's the Istanbul process that brings together. But again, it brings together, with the exception of people like Miakhel side, it brings together former commanders who are out of power right now, and who were central to the imbalance of justice and rights and governance originally post-Bonn, at Bonn. You look at my transcripts from the interviews of people who are at Bonn, you can see the power play, the power shifts there. So thinking about some of those are interesting. And in your group also, your group is engaging with a lot of the other coalitions.
Can I add something? Based on my, experience when I was in the government, or, if I'm active, now this is the information age, before, like in 80s, I used to work for Voice of America, and the people more depends on the radio, BBC and Voice of America, but now information age. Whatever you just write, people, read it, or people know in the villages there. People are very active in social media there. Every interview I gave or write some things, I get a feedback, from the people there. And when I was, governor of Nangarhar, I used social media. That was the only tool I had it, and to communicate with the people, and just bypass the traditional, powerful people there, but it helped, there. So people are more engaged, and people are more mature politically also. If they see the right approach, and they see really these people are working for their interests or for the stability of the country, they will support that.
This leads to a follow-up question. Having all the consensus amongst Afghans, civil society, political groups, even you mentioned some of the leaders of the current regime do not agree with the restrictive policies. If that is the situation, why all these groups have failed to mobilize men inside Afghanistan for women and girls' rights? Whenever there is a protest inside Kabul, only a group of women come to the street. Men do not come. Why has that failure?
The thing is that we have to study the context of the regimes, what kind of regime you have. They allow the people to organize, they allow the people to come out to the streets and demonstrate. So a dictatorship, and especially those who capture power by arms or by force, they will not allow that. So the question is not how people organize, and we don't have a strong political parties in Afghanistan. Many people just give example, okay, you saw in Turkey, the people came out the street, they prevented the coup in Turkey. But there were the political parties, they mobilized the people there. In Afghanistan, we don't have, that was the reason is, one way we are disagree with all these former warlords, you just call it strong men and others. But in the same, they are the one who only have a political party organized, Then people look to them for solution, but in the same time, they complain from them, there. So that was the reason we don't have a political party and leaders that people believe in, then come out the street and they have, raise their voices, that's not existing. So that was, if we have that expectation, people will uprise, and upon some, that doesn't work. Because we don't have a political party, we don't have a credible leaders, to mobilize all these people. And the Taliban, they don't allow to organize, there. So that was that expectation, I believe, is doesn't work. So that was the reason I said back, just go back to the. Our issue is the Afghan side is one of part of the issue. We are fragmented because of our different actors. Because each of these groups, they have a relation, with different countries. They're not independent.
Miakhel, so this question I would also.
I'm just coming back to the UN issue, because there are some regional consensus, international consensus, and consensus among the Afghans, built. They came with that report, and that was, passed by the UN Security National Security Resolutions. So that was the reason how we can find some kind of implementation for that, mechanism. And that no one included, including the Taliban, there. So I don't see any other solution in the country, like go to the street to mobilize people or armed struggle, or, the opposition will be in the position to just, overthrow Taliban. I think that's maybe a little bit,
Thank you. I would come with the same question with a little adding to it the regional perspective. Having consensus, I think it exists on the human rights issue, specifically women and girls' rights. So what are the future strategies? Can these political groups utilize their regional linkages and favors that they have for something on the human rights?
Just to go back to your previous question about men engaging. So one thing, as someone who focuses on gender, we just had a conference at Stanford that I hosted last week. There was a symposium, 2 days on the contours of confronting gender apartheid, codification of gender apartheid in international law. So we had Afghan human rights lawyers and from different institutions working towards that campaign. We talked about men's role in the campaign and men's roles inside the country. But one thing you have to realize is, yes, the restrictions are extreme and harsh on women, where they've been pretty much erased. But it's not that the men have it that much better. That's something we leave out. Men under the Taliban are also being oppressed. And we can't lose sight of that, because you have to think many of the men are forced into silence and compliance. So there's a group of men in that society who perhaps benefit from the suppression of women in the control, but there's a good majority who don't. Women can't work, girls can't go to school, they don't have economic, livelihoods. And so if some of the women from Afghanistan say, if we encourage our men to go out on the street and protest and they get detained and they go into Taliban prison, who's going to make money to feed us? We can't work. The girls can't go to school, the women can't work, and this is going to become even deeply entrenched into the process. So if the men go out and protest in large numbers, the surveillance state of the Taliban will pick them up, detain them, torture them, disappear them, and then they don't have anyone, then they're a widowed household. So those are some of the realities that sometimes we don't think about from this perspective. And I'm not one to defend, the men's rights in that way, but you have to look at it across both sides. I may have left out what the question you wanted to ask
The
now.
way forward.
Way
So
forward. So something that came up at the conference, I'm not gonna take credit for it. Somebody came up and I think it was a man, and he said, why don't we press, and I know this is gonna sound controversial, I'm sorry, but I think we're at the point with Afghanistan that you have to be bold with this thinking. Someone said, why don't we pressure Saudi Arabia, since we have diplomatic ties, to not allow any Afghan to attend Hajj, the pilgrimage to Mecca, until they reinstate the rights of women and girls based on Islam in Afghanistan. Wow, what a statement, right? That would be amazing, because if you're not gonna follow part of Sharia, then you're not allowed to, then we won't allow you to engage in the other part. You can't pick and choose. So I think that's bold, and I think that's some of the strategies, as we talk about strategies, if people are serious, if the world is serious about a feminist future in women and girls' rights in Afghanistan, at the most important feminist crisis in the world right now, human rights crisis, but also a feminist issue, then let's take those approaches. No Afghan can go to Hajj. We'll see how much there's uprising against some of these edicts.
beside that, do you see an opportunity for scholarly contesting the Sharia interpretation of Taliban, again, by Muslim countries or scholars?
We've tried. I mean, Annie is part of, Annie, we're all calling on you because Annie's such a good colleague from, who worked in Afghanistan and still engages. We're on the same group, Women Together Stronger. Probably letters to write to OIC, the Organization of Islamic Countries, as Together Stronger, a group of women, human rights activists, but also former Republic representatives, women inside Afghanistan. The OIC has made their effort to make a statement. So if you look up the OIC and then look up their statements, they have. We can go further of it, having them issue the fatwa, not more than they can. But the Taliban don't see the OIC in the vein of their version of Islam. They don't see anyone. They see themselves as the new caliphate. They see themselves. They call Haqqani Khalifa. Like that's their interpretation. So they don't feel that they feel that all these other Islamic countries are infidels. Like they don't see their version.
No, just, the ulamas in Afghanistan and the war and the region, YC and all of them, they raise their voices, the current, policy of Taliban is not, aligned with the Sharia. Even many of their own, followers, they are not agree with that. But the question is, that to change their minds? No. Even they didn't like those educated people who were educated in Azhar or university and others, even religious scholars, they would like that also,
Miakhel said, if we look
I
into
wish,
this,
I wish they were, scholars, Islamic scholars, and they believe on Islam, and then they will change them. This is their own, in the time of the Prophet, and you cannot see these models.
if we
Oh my
compare
gosh, the
this
Prophet
to,
would be outraged by this. I'm sorry, I've studied that, but it would be outraged by this version.
Miakhel said, if we compare this section of the specifically restriction over girls and women with the two other components of the engagements that have taken place, counter narcotics and counter terrorism, do you think there is something in the negotiation itself and the tactics and strategies that made those two components successful, but not the human rights component successful?
Honestly, both of them is not successful, because for the counterterrorism, still, the ISIS-K activities exist there. The other extremist group is there. The TTP and others, they are active. And I believe, like I mentioned before, you cannot prevent, terrorism by terrorists. It's not possible. Or you cannot just, suppress extremism by extremists. It's not possible. So that was one issue, but this is not only their issue. Unfortunately, with the extremism, in the region, it is a problem of each country. As long as they don't change their policies, but extremists or bad extremists, should not be differentiated between that. Just say all extremists, extremism, so that was the issue. And the narcotics also, I was just reading my notes other night as from Halima, I had a trip there one. And who benefit from those ban? The top leaders, the smugglers, For example, the prices of opium was before banning, it was something like $200. But now it is around per kg, and now is $800 or $900 per kg. Yes, the quantity is reduced, but the price, the benefits, the drug dealers, they make a lot of benefits, regional, international dealers with that. So, but yes, the farmer will suffer, that is a different issue. Because we don't have an alternative, to the farmers, because the farm get prices even in all time, that the farmers not benefit that much. But who are the drug dealers? Who are involving those drugs there? Many, the Taliban leaders and regional, people and others are involved in there. And so, but if this has happened, yes, this year, the next year they will cultivate it more because they cannot feed the people, there. And so it is a 1 year approach doesn't solve the issue, there. So there is no comprehensive long-term approach to this issue. Let's go back to the governance issue, it is coming.
Dr. Halima, do you see any tactical and strategic issues with the negotiation itself, making some components more agreeable to the international community and some not?
So I think some of the things to think about is the positioning of groups. So we've talked about, so let's say the UN, the US, and regional states, if we categorize into 3. So the UN, I'm just going to use women's rights as an example. Women's rights remain non-negotiable in economic public messaging. But then the US has a strong rhetorical support, but less operational leverage. So the messaging is off. And regional states don't mention anything about women's rights in formal engagements. So you have 3 different processes being pursued just on women's rights. And so we think about counterterrorism, think about security, all of those. And the messaging is very different. The posturing is very different. And with the US, rhetorically, they say the right things, but as far as the US government, but operational leverage, there's no follow-up there. So just thinking about possibilities for engagement, I was just thinking about it last night, I was writing notes. There could be a unified conditions statement by the UN, US, EU, OIC, and regional. I mean, this would take a lot of, planning and logistical, that they create a joint demands document, prioritizing girls' education, freedom of movement, no arbitrary arrests of activists, not just rooting it in women's issues, but also arbitrary arrests affect men and affect households. And so I would see that as bringing together these voices that are giving different messaging, and the Taliban have learned how to navigate that difference in messaging. So I think that's something to think about. And then, I mean, definitely I'm just thinking off the top of my head, but thinking about how do we incentivize local compliance on the ground in Afghanistan. So the Taliban use a decentralized structure. So I think we have to be more creative here and thinking the Taliban are not a monolith. They don't think alike. They're very fragmented. They're very different levels of ideology. And so thinking about solutions based on the way that they're structured, they're decentralized. So we could encourage local level compliance, create intra-Taliban competition for benefits. That would fragment them even more, I think. So there's more to say about that. There's more to say about every of these questions, but I'm just thinking those two start to look at security, terrorism, women's issues, and human rights as part of the joint statement.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Miakhel. So, as it happens with every discussion and conversation, the time limit plays its role. So we could have talked about more questions and discussed this further in detail, but at this point, I would like to open the floor for the questions. So I will take first question from you. If you briefly introduce yourself and then your question, and I think we will take 2 questions at a time and then respond to it. Please.
Yeah, thank you so much for being here and giving us such a formative presentation. My name is Shahmahmood. I left Afghanistan, as you mentioned, the repeated cycle of generation that happens to Afghanistan, that each couple of years people just leave Afghanistan. In 2011, I became a refugee in Germany, in that country. So now here at Columbia, studying Master of International Affairs and my second semester at International Security Policy concentration. So I appreciate that you have mentioned that the international community, Afghans, also regional countries, all kind of failed, but it's also something obvious. We have seen that after the 20 years presence of the United States in Afghanistan, and that happened at the end. And you, Dr. Kazem, you mentioned also that the policy was kind of flawed, the policy of the US, which is also very, very obvious thing. Because actually the goal of the US was also not to bring peace in Afghanistan, was more to combat terrorism in Afghanistan as a reply to the 9/11 attacks, which in my opinion, you cannot combat terrorism when you don't stop the financial aid which goes to the Taliban or other terrorist groups or countries who sell weapons to the Taliban. Like when you don't stop that, they just become more powerful, but also is also the fact in Afghanistan. And you have also mentioned that the flawed thing in Bonn conference, which is also a reality. But my question is, like, before coming to that, like, because in Afghanistan, we in that Bonn conference, they don't involve Taliban. That's right. But then we had this 200 or 250 warlords which were there. Why don't they say anything to the US or international community? Let's bring Taliban. Let's involve the Taliban as well, because they were like very happy to come to the power and get their positions in the government. And they were also actually people who in the 90s did worse things than the Taliban in Afghanistan. They ruined Kabul and they killed lots of people in Afghanistan, these people which were at the power in the last 20 years in Afghanistan. And the corruption, you didn't mention that one when you talked about the Afghan failures, which have taken hope from Afghan people because they have seen, like from 2001 until 2010, everything was really good. I left Afghanistan in 2011 when everything getting very much worse, like the financial aid which was in Afghanistan provided was not really used in a proper way, and so on. And that you have mentioned that the regional countries, they have their own interest. China, as a P5 member, has its own interest. That's something like it's common, it's obvious. Like we know each country is interested in their own interest. So my thing is that what's the role of Afghan people? How long do we want to wait that Western countries come with a great, proper approach to risk has and to just make Afghanistan a great place again? And I see also in the opposition that there are only again these warlords like I don't know, Sayyad, like Karzai, like Abdullah, like these people which were actually at the power in the last 20 years and didn't do anything for Afghan people. So what do you think? Are they ready to share the power when they come back to the power? Because they are the same people which they don't want to let youth or other people to be involved. Also, women, we have like a couple of women like Barak Say, Fawzia Kufi, they are everywhere and they talk always the same things which they have talked about in the last 20 years. So my question to be specific, that how long do we want to wait for others to discuss, and also are we ready to share the power with others?
You will take one more question and then come back to your questions. Thank you, Marjan,
Thank
for your question.
Thanks for taking my question. My name is Matt Dawson. I'm a member of the Saltzman Institute. First, some good news to share. I have a daughter. She's in 7th grade. She has an essay to write completely on her own without any prompting from her father. Has decided to write about women's rights in Afghanistan, her argumentative essay. So I've been helping her with that. I'm not sure where she got the idea, but she got it from somewhere. I really like your question, so I had that question, but I'll cede that to her. My question is, Bond and engagement with the Taliban, people will say it's the original sin of the war in Afghanistan is that we did not invite the Taliban, which is easy to say in hindsight. Was it even politically feasible at the time to have invited them? And is it politically feasible now to engage with the Taliban? And if not, then how do we change the attitudes of our elected officials to make it feasible to even engage with them, with the Taliban meaningfully now in 2025? So thank you.
Thank you for your question. I think we will, how do you want to choose?
I'm just gonna clarify Marjan, what is specifically, there were 5 questions and I
I
think what you
noticed
said.
two
Two,
from
actually.
her.
Yeah.
There was,
Yes,
okay.
one is
And
that
what would you
how
like
long
to-
we have to wait for
In-
others to help us. I'm just trying to.
Okay, and
maybe-
who is we?
Afghans,
Afghans, okay, but we're not a
specifically
monolith.
those who were at the power and who have the financial, they have lots of wealth outside Afghanistan, in Dubai, in Switzerland, all those people which were at the power, and also the educated people like us, like you, like
I think to step back into be realistic about the role of the diaspora in Afghanistan, having lived through different grounds, the anxiety we have about what happens inside Afghanistan, but being very realistic of how much as Afghans in the diaspora we can influence from the outside. I'm not saying there's no influence, but I'm just saying we have to be realistic, and the desires, the desires of Afghans who are inside Afghanistan may not reflect our desires. And also, I also say, that's why I asked who are we? Because Afghanistan is so economically, socially, ethnically diverse that you and I, our priorities here may not reflect the majority who want a certain kind of life there. So I just take that back and say, thinking about privilege, our privilege, who we are, that becomes very central. And I don't always like to think of Afghans as monoliths, as one group with one shared objectives, with one history. I mean, we saw that with the communist regime, of how a certain disenfranchised group felt that they were being represented, and then an elite group wasn't. So as a historian, I look back and think about what were people thinking at the time when certain events happened. And we always take the perspective of, I should say, historians or documented historical material on Afghanistan seems to take the perspective of the privileged and not always the perspective of those of others. And I think that's been a very big problem in the history of Afghanistan. So that would just be one short answer to that.
On the question of the Matt's question on was it politically feasible back in 2001 and 2, And is it feasible even today for the elected officials to engage?
On power sharing, power sharing doesn't work. Many, even in this right environment, it is a problem, all these. So that was the reason, if you look all these governments in the back, it was a power sharing. The Khalq Democratic, that was a power sharing government. Didn't work. The Mujahideen was a power sharing, didn't work. The Taliban was, came power, and the Pun was also power sharing. So that was, we believe on a process, not exclude, and not have a monopoly of power. If that's not happen, so one group will take power and they will suppress the others will find somewhere to just, fight against them. And many interests, everything is existing, and for destruction, you don't need that much, resources. I remember when there was, Geneva Accord was, signed. Miakhel, he came to Peshawar and had a discussion with us. At that time I was working for Voice of America. What do you think about this negative symmetry? Meaning is the West and the US, they will not give arms to the Mujahideen, and the Soviet will not give it to the Kabul, government. And I told him this doesn't work, because we have enough arms in the country, and we can recruit few people to destabilize the government, there. And so that was, we just, the failure of governance, Afghanistan is a problem. If you don't find a solution for that, then we cannot solve most of these issues. Coming to the specific to the Bonn, it was not feasible at that time, because Bonn was a reaction to the, attacks on the US, and the government at that time, they wanted to have a reaction. That was the reason they didn't went to Afghanistan with a 5-year strategy, what we're supposed to do. So it was a kind of a reaction, because the superpower, economic centers, military centers, political center was hit. And so that was reaction has happened. On 16 September 2001, which is 5 days later, after September 11, one of my friend David Edwards, who's teaching in Williams College, and we wrote a op-ed in Washington Post, which was published at that time, 5 days after the September 11, because we knew the US will go to Afghanistan. And we just mentioned that if you make the same mistakes like the Soviets did in Afghanistan, you will end up with the same result. And that op-ed was read by Rumsfeld, and he sent it as a memo to the Vice President Dick Cheney, at that time, which was declassified, those information. So the reason was that it was not feasible. The problem was after, when the emergency law jirga happened, because I wrote a book in Pashto on this emergency law jirga, the decision of the people was undermined in the emergency law jirga. Because at that time, people wanted, change will be
just to Loya Jirga is the Grand Council of the Afghan.
Sorry,
Is it for solving the big national?
Can you remind everyone when that was for the Grand Loya Jirga? What time frame?
It was in 2002.
Okay.
Yeah, because by the agreement in the Bonn agreement, so there should be a emergency this Jirga Grand Council in 6 months, and then in 1.5 years there will be constitution will be drafted. Constitution will be approved, by the Loya Jirga, by the Grand Assembly. Then we'll have a presidential and parliamentary election. So this was a process, that. So the first process was failure, And the failure was that people wanted two things at that Loya Jirga, because I was a member of that. The king should be as the head of state, and Kazem should be as a prime minister. That was a discussion at that time. Even, I was not in favor of parliamentary system, in Afghanistan context, but that was the people wanted at that time. But this decision was undermined by our good friends, the US, the Miakhel was there, and people criticized that. That was one issue. The second issue, based on the Loya Jirga, the decision, 5 key positions should be approved or, by the Loya Jirga. Minister of Defense, Interior, Foreign Ministry, Chief Justice, and the head of the NDS. And that was also not, accepted by President Kazem in the US, at that time. So that was the reason as the power changed. And people lost hope. And that, people had, expectations. So when the presidential elections happened, people lost a little bit, hope. When then the parliamentary elections happened in 2005, then people lost, hope completely. The reason is that the same warlords or, the powerful or criminally call it whatever, they just took political power, economic power, and security power. And they involved, whatever, corruption, you just want to talk about that, or illegal activities and other drug and everything. So that was the reason is the failure of the government started from the emergency, Loya Jirga, the Grand Assemblies happened, and then subsequent, later on from the parliamentary election, which has happened. And that was in 2006, people completely, the government lost credibility. And the Helmand things will happen and others, that was a result.
So
that
I just-
was-
I
I
want
would
to
like
ask-
to actually, to respond to the second part of the question. Is it feasible today in United States to enable elected officials to engage
In Afghanistan?
on a level that,
Can we bring them into we've talked about being inclusive, but, we hear from elected officials in the Trump administration, we're not gonna talk to the Taliban, they're terrorists. There's still this attitude that, they're bad guys, so we should engage.
So I think just going back further from Bud, because someday I interviewed somebody, I think most people would know him on expert on Afghanistan, who was there at Bonn and who actually was called into the White House at the end of September in 2001. I don't want to say the names, but and was asked, what do you think we should do on Afghanistan as far as like moving forward with governance? The problem I think also is looking at it, timeline wise, is that from the way that I synthesize what has been written, is that the initial insertion of US in Afghanistan were not ISAF or the troops, they were the CIA. And the CIA was already dropping loads of money and negotiating with the North, with the groups from the North as the proxy force for filling the security gap. And so that becomes very essential here at Bonn also, is because no one expected, the US military and the CIA didn't expect the Taliban to desert Kabul as quickly as they did. They just disappeared, they just evaporated.
Yep.
And they left. And so that left a security vacuum, which the US military at that point was not in a position to mobilize that quickly. And so it left Kabul insecure. And so people have said, as much as we criticize the North or whatever, there was a security vacuum, they came in to take it. But that created leverage for the North, which they took their leverage at Bonn. And so you have to piece things together, timelines, because Bonn becomes, so that initial US operation was not planned. The CIA was doing something very different than what the White House was starting to do. And so my oral histories start to piece together and put timelines in place, and there are multiple things happening. And so why I bring this up is Bonn wouldn't have been possible to power share because of that decision. The group that came in to secure Kabul wanted to be repaid in Bonn. I'm not a political person, but I study historical timelines in order to put them together. And I think that's where a lot of the problem was. And so that places us contextually over the period of the Republic to where we are now. And then the point of engagement with Khalilzad and team, or even before Khalilzad, some of the State Department people under Trump 1, in their initial engagement with the Taliban and leaving the Republic completely sidelined. Those two decisions create the conditions in which we engage with the Taliban right now. I think history is very important. Looking at it in just a moment captured in time right now is not effective without looking at those decisions historically.
think Miakhel said he wants.
Just on this, in the point, the session was the Northern Allies should not enter Kabul. But since the government is collapsed, the Taliban is collapsing quickly. So Northern Allies, entered Kabul because the idea was that the Kabul should be like demilitarized zone, Then whatever, Grand Assembly or Constitution happen, then, people have a free, should not control by one group or people. So that was the same happened with the Taliban. In Doha, Taliban should not enter Kabul. But they say, okay, we entered because the government left and collapsed, and that was the reason we just entered there, It is just like.
You fill the security vacuum and then you don't want to give up power. Why power share now?
You will take two more questions. Yes, please.
Thank you very much. My name is Emir and I'm a student at Columbia. The essence of my question is perhaps one, but I would like to pose two different, same question from two different perspectives for dear speakers. In an interview with Yalda Hakim, also a woman of Afghan heritage, the Pakistani Defense Minister Khaja Asif, when asked about Pakistan's relationship with the Taliban, blatantly mentioned that Pakistan has been doing the dirty work for the US for the past 30 years. So the question that I want to ask is, and this is not a fact that was unknown or neither to the Afghan government nor to the US government. So the question that I want to ask is, instead of perhaps mystifying Taliban as this unbeatable force, as this force that we have never faced on an, I would say, on this scale, why did we not, or if there was ever this suggestion of instead of engaging them on different levels and different with different strategies, why was it never suggested that perhaps the US or other countries in the region try to cut the bloodline to the Taliban or the financial and material support lines? Why was there that? So the two perhaps the two questions I want to pose to Dr. Kazem is, if there was ever a suggestion made to the US government to, instead of engaging the Taliban on a counter-terrorism or on a counter-insurgency basis in Afghanistan, was there ever a suggestion of putting pressure on Pakistan to perhaps stop this support of the Taliban, or on other countries like Qatar for hosting Taliban's political office? And perhaps the question I would like to ask Mr. Miakhel is, if there was ever a suggestion of similar context from the Afghan government was made to perhaps the international community of, instead of, well, you guys are spending millions and billions of dollars and putting your citizen life, but was there ever a suggestion made of putting those, I would say, wedges of pressure on perhaps these regional actors?
We will take one more question and then, yes, please.
Yeah, my name is John Famella. I'm a second-year law student here at Columbia, and tomorrow is the 50th anniversary of the fall of Saigon and the end of the Vietnam War. And I was just curious if during these negotiations with the U.S. and the Taliban, if there was any sense of historical context where, during the end of the Vietnam War, the U.S. was directly interfacing with the North Vietnamese government, but it was completely ignoring the wishes of the Southern Vietnamese regime. So I was just curious if there was any kind of historical awareness of that during these negotiations with the Taliban.
Okay, thank you. So, as Amir asked that,
Pakistan.
yes, and
There's a lot we can say about Pakistan. I think that's just hours and hours. The generals I've talked to, US generals, talk about what they see on the ground. So everything has to be taken with a grain of salt. So all the US generals I've talked to talk about how they would tell Washington, they tell the White House what was happening on the ground, how efforts were the money that was being spent on counterterrorism, training the Afghan national forces to counter what were coming across the border, but the diplomatic side wasn't doing its side on the Pakistan side. So that's just really being kind of vague. But yes, military generals went to, at different times of the war, went to the White House, gave presentations about the border, the porous border, being able to, insurgents being able to move back and forth, the support. And then you also have people talking about how certain US diplomats and generals would fly Islamabad first and then Kabul. So, I mean, I have documentation evidence of this in the oral histories. So you think about that, and one thing, there's so much to say, but one thing that comes to mind that I could point to that came out in the interviews, and I interviewed the CIA agent who actually apprehended Mullah Baradar, who's in the current government, Taliban government right now, in 2010. So I interviewed her. She's the CIA operative who located him. And they captured Baradar, who was lead Taliban leader, and they kept him in a Pakistani prison, and then eventually let him go after a couple of years. Why wasn't he extradited to Afghanistan and tried there? What happened with the diplomatic relations there? Why didn't the US CIA ask, and I asked the ambassadors of the time, the US ambassador to Pakistan, who then became the US ambassador in Afghanistan, I said, why didn't they hand him over? Why did they keep him? Why did the US allow Pakistan to keep Mullah Baradar in Pakistan in 2010, which was very critical? Why not bring him in? Why not bring him in, question him in Kabul, perhaps even get him to change sides? But Baradar was very active in the Doha process. So more of a question back to you, more of a question of thinking about, well, why did these things happen? So I asked these questions to ambassadors, to CIA agents, to Afghan politicians, like, tell me what happened at that time. Like, this is a very critical moment we can point to say, what's the relationship here between Kabul, DC, and Islamabad? What happened?
And on the question to John on the learning from what happened in Vietnam, was it studied in Afghanistan? I think that's how you
Yeah, I was like curious
Comparison.
kind of going directly to the Taliban, not dealing with the Afghan Republican government at that time. It really seems very similar to how the Vietnam War was negotiated by Kissinger.
And the generals who I talked to, who would have probably had more of the information about that, didn't reference Vietnam. They were fairly younger generals at that time. I'm just trying to think. Ikenberry was probably one of the older ones. Trying to think about who I've interviewed. They did the Yugoslav War, but they referenced that quite a bit. And then the first Gulf War, which really wasn't that long. And then instead of what I heard, I don't know what happened with Pentagon, like on September 11th, that month of September. I don't have as much detail and evidence there, but I know that more of the commanders that ended up in Iraq, which was 2 years later after the US-Afghan war started, those tactics, those lessons learned were crossed over to Afghanistan more than from Vietnam. Because it was a current war, they thought that the ethnic conflict, they thought that the religious issue were similar, but they weren't. And so the doctrine, the Point doctrine that then develops in Iraq gets repurposed and adjusted for Afghanistan. Many of those generals, US generals, end up going back and forth between Iraq and Afghanistan, which complicates the situation even more when you put in the strand of Iraq's war right at the pretty much start of the US-Afghan war.
Miakhel said at that time when the negotiations were taking place in 2020, before 2020, I think you were in the Ministry of,
I was with USAP.
or you were at the USIP. And then in 2020, when the Afghan government started negotiation, with Taliban post Doha Agreement. Then you were in the Ministry of Defense. Okay,
I just went and what it last,
that's I wanted to have your
Yeah.
on this question.
No, the question of the Saigon and, yes, some people in the previous administrations, they had that experience. For example, James Dobbin, he was the one who, or architecture of, the one agreement. And also he was ambassador to Afghanistan, and he was with, junior officer, but he was involved with the Vietnam, negotiation, which I had a discussion, with him one time. Yes, all these are similar issues. The same situation. The US wanted to leave, but they didn't want to leave. The government should collapse, and then they will have, be blamed for all the problems, there. In 2009, I had a discussion with the assessment team of President Obama, sent to Kabul. Ambassador Newman and David Sidney and others, they were there. And I told them, at that time, because they asked me, what do you think about our strategy? I said, do you have a strategy? The reason why I asked because I told them, in my level, I don't understand what is the purpose of the US presence in Afghanistan, for nation building, counter-terrorism, regional interests, whatever. They couldn't explain that, So if you cannot explain your objective, how you will have a strategy for that? That's not possible, there. So then he asked me the question, would you like to, us to leave? I said, I'm not asking you to leave, but I'm just asking you if somebody died from the heart attack or somebody died from the chronic diseases, what does make a difference? This is, I talk with you also on something. No, so if then you die, from both illness. But heart attack is easy because then you will not suffer and will not have a more expensive than others. Now I just told him, you just decide you want to, because this strategy will lead to the failure, The question, because at that time was, the General Petraeus wanted to have increased forces. So my argument was that there is not question of how many forces you have. The question is what you want to achieve. What is the goal and objectives? If that is not clear, then the resources create more conflicts. So, yes, if you are counter-terrorism, the Afghan government, President Karzai and President Ashraf Ghani and all politicians repeatedly says, the basis of terrorism, because we say Quetta Shura, we say Peshawar Shura, all these leaders are in Quetta or Pakistan and others, there. So Bin Laden was killed near to Islamabad, there. So the root cause is the problem is there why we are fighting in Afghanistan, in the villages here. This was a huge discussion, a lot of discussion on these issues happened. But unfortunately, it was not addressed, of this issue, because the reason was that the politician in the top, they make a decision of their own political interests, and the time they don't look to what has happened there.
There's a good book, Miakhel mentioned James Dobbin, who was a amazing diplomat with a career. His book from 2017, I wanted to point you to because he addresses this. It's James Dobbin's 2017 Foreign Service, 5 decades on the front lines of American diplomacy, and he compares Vietnam and Afghanistan. So that might be useful.
Okay, okay, you will have one short question. That will be last.
Thank you very much. My name is Ubaidullah Karimi, and I'm a second-year student of International Affairs, and I'm also a fellow at Saltzman Institute. Thank you very much for all these events and history, for sharing those, and that has shaped whatever the reality is in Afghanistan right now. So I'll steer the discussion back to right now. You mentioned that the anti-Taliban front is scattered. Taliban are strong on the field in Afghanistan. Another civil unrest is not in the favor of anyone. So I will bring the question back to this, that what are that coercive tools that international community, whether UN, whether any actor can use to force the Taliban to solve this only issue of allowing girls, like forcing Taliban to allow girls to go back to school. Yeah, I know that the sanction has not worked. Diplomacy has failed. we have seen the result of military. Islamic countries, they've tied their hands. UN is also helpless. So I would say, like, what are those tools? I will pose this question to both of you. What are those tools that can be used? Thank you.
In my short answer, first of all, I'm very happy, see young Afghans, they are studying here, in Colombia. So this is I'm very proud of you. And you guys, for you, it's very important to learn from all these people. Hopefully, you guys will play a role in the future, the big issue, again, just because I don't want to go more into this, maybe take more 1 hour to discuss, For example, if the Taliban, decided to open the school tomorrow, Afghanistan problem cannot be solved. We still have enough problem to just deal with that. This is, you maybe lose the narrative. Okay, Taliban is becoming good. The rights which people deserve, they just give it back to the people. But the question of addressing the legitimacy of the government, poverty, economic developments, education, yes, they open the schools, but they only teach, the madrasa curriculum in the school, So what you will do with that? So the question is not only open school, the question what they supposed to teach in the school. If they just teach, more extremism to the boys and also to the girls, what will we ended up, 5 years or 10 years from now? So this is not only issue, there. Yes, for the international, you can say, okay, this is a issue you can use as a political tools to, criticize Taliban. That is a good thing. But this is not the end of the story. Would you like to?
I think there's still a lot of work that the diaspora can do in the sense of, so I'll give you a website. It's aewa.org, AWA. That's the Alliance on the Education of Women of Afghanistan. I'm on the steering committee. And we partner with the Afghanistan AUAF, the American University of Afghanistan, their group. And we have an alliance. So we don't want to be in this position, but because we are, and as a diaspora, this is what we can do. Because I've learned over the years that lobbying and activism is not just it's not the only thing we can do. So we've created almost a Ministry of Education in exile for Afghanistan. So if they're not going to create it in country and serve people, we've created this infrastructure where we have organizations all over the world who are teaching online and on the ground in Afghanistan, girls and women trying to fill that space. But they all work in ad hoc ways, had been working in very ad hoc ways, and had no centralized system. They didn't have accreditation. There were no continuity of pathways for education. So we created those. And so we meet once a year. We meet in person. We have 89 organizations inside Afghanistan and outside globally who are working on girls' education. It's not the solution because we shouldn't have to replace what the Taliban should be doing, but they're not. But we do this in the interim because eventually the situation in Afghanistan will change. And we want to make sure that there are educated girls and women who can fall right into place, that there's no gap and there's no education gap there. So those are some of the things that diaspora are doing, and they're doing incredible work. We don't share much on social media because the more you share this stuff, then they go after these groups and shut it down. But if you want to engage as young Afghans or young people who, in college, who want to engage in solutions, in even if they're intermediate solutions, there's a lot of work there and space. Sometimes when we address the political spaces, I feel like I pull back because I feel like I go in circles and there's a lot of political talk, but sometimes engaging in actual activities that support women and girls and people in Afghanistan, it feels much better.
Also, very short question, very short. It's very.
Did I get them because they haven't asked the question and then we'll come back to you? Thank you.
My name is Zahid and I'm a graduate student of Columbia Engineering, pursuing a medical physics program here. I'm working with the NYU as a medical physicist assistant. And just left the country with the US force withdrawal. So I was part of this chaos. Since witnessing these things in firsthand and having that impact on our young population in my nation and people, I would like to remind first of all, which is very necessary in front of all the people around the table right here. The first thing, the assurance of Zalmay Khalilzad, the special envoy of US government in 2020, that he publicly assured Afghanistan public and US public that Taliban are changed now. After that, my one clear question about the US mission, military and strategical values upholding mission is achieved after the withdrawal or not? Just very shortly and briefly. The second question, if both ends, the current regime of Taliban and the previous Republican government, Democratic Republican government, with lack of these resources and options right now, assume if they got agreed on an inclusive government, is there a transparent way or method that we can share government, or we can make an inclusive government transparently, which was a challenge for 2 decades back there?
I think the transparency part will be always a question, but I will allow Miakhel
So
to.
thank you for this question, is in the government, I'm just talking about the system, is there. Each government has a problem, it's not something, new. We just say we cannot get a government which have no problem, there. But we need a process that people should able to, have raise their voice, I'm not saying the Republic was very good, there was a lot of problems with existing in the Republic, but people could say whatever they wanted, they can organize themselves, they, have most of these young people I just see, you are a product of this last 20 years, there. And so many people got their educations, but now people have a, voice in these things. So that was, the US achieved some things or not? This is yes and no question, on what aspect if you want to, see it. Yes, political objective is not achieved. To leave a stable government behind, that was the one objective, which was not happening. Another objective was there to, eliminate or, prevent extremism. That is not achieved. Counter narcotics was another issue people were just talking, there. So it's not addressed, there. Poverty was not addressed. Institutionalizing, democracy, that was not, as happened. But then on other side, yes, the US achieved their objective, they wanted to, react, and they, wanted to leave Afghanistan from the very, very beginning, But, sometimes politicians say something in the media that is a different thing. But reality was that the US was not there in Afghanistan for nation building. So that was a reality on the ground. But in the public, they were saying we'll have a Marshall Plan for Afghanistan, we'll have a nation building and all these things. No, that was not happening. And the other one problem was that, yes, the US wanted to leave Afghanistan, but not on, the cost of like what, how they withdraw. They want to leave Afghanistan from the very beginning, Then you will ask why they stayed for 20 years. That was a different reason, for that. And the Afghan government problem was that, or the Afghan problem was that you were just thinking US is not leaving. So we depended too much on the US presence, and we wanted they will be here forever and they will support us and, give the money and everything. We didn't do our own work. But the region, the regional countries, they knew the US is leaving. And they had their own, hedging strategy, and they just engaged with the Taliban, supported them, Eventually, we ended up with the situations.
Again, if we can take that question to the after session, because Dr. Halima Kazem also has a flight back, so we need to. What do you think?
Yeah.
I mean, to take the question when
At the
the
end,
session,
yeah, sure.
Okay. Thank you very much, Dr. Kazem, Miakhel, for taking time, and thank you. I'm thankful to all of you to participate and attend. I think the question was complex, but how we can influence the current regime on human rights. We do not have a clear answer, but we do have a few very good points. For example, the individual engagement for educating girls and women in Afghanistan. For example, creating consensus like the Hajj issue that you mentioned, creating consensus among the stronger and wealthy Muslim countries. For example, Afghan political groups engaging with the regional countries, that regional countries create a more consensus on the human rights issue. But the overall takeaway, I think, is that unless there is not a broader governance issue, the governance system problem is not resolved, the human rights issues will continue. I think we will have a report of this, and hopefully with the participants on the list, we will share it. And thank you very much once again for your attention.